You are listening to Trash Radio, presented by QueensTrash.com.
Fyodor Dostoevsky, Russian author, born at Moscow on the 30th of October, 1821, was the second son of a retired military surgeon of a decayed noble family. He was educated at Moscow and the Military Engineering Academy at St. Petersburg, which he left in 1843 with the grade of sub-lieutenant. Next year, his father died, and he resigned his commission in order to devote himself to literature. Thus commencing a long struggle with ill health and penury. In addition to the old Russian masters, Gogol and Pushkin, Balzac and George Sand supplied him with literary ideals. He knew little of Dickens, but his first story is thoroughly Dickensian in character. The hero is a Russian, Tom Pinch, who entertains a pathetic, humble adoration for a fair young girl, a solitary waif like himself. Characteristically, the Russian story ends in tender gloom. The girl marries a middle-aged man of property. The hero dies of a broken heart, and his funeral is described in lamentable detail. The germ of all Dostoevsky's imaginative work may be discovered here. The story was submitted in manuscript to the Russian critic Bielinski and excited his astonishment by its power over the emotions. It appeared in the course of 1846 in the Recueil de St. Petersburg under the title of Poor People. An English version, Poor Folk, with an introduction by George Moore, appeared in 1894. The successful author became a regular contributor of short tales to the Annals of the Country, a monthly periodical conducted by Krevsky, but he was wretchedly paid, and his work, though revealing extraordinary power and intensity, commonly lacks both finish and proportion. Poverty and physical suffering robbed him of the joy of life and filled him with bitter thoughts and morbid imaginings. During 1847, he became an enthusiastic member of the revolutionary reunions of the political agitator Petrachevsky. Many of the students and younger members did little more than discuss the theories of Charles Fourier and other economists at these gatherings. Exaggerated reports were eventually carried to the police, and on the 23rd of April, 1849, Dostoevsky and his brother, with 30 other suspected personages, were arrested. After a short examination, by the secret police, they were lodged in the fortress of St. Peter and St. Paul at St. Petersburg, in which confinement Fyodor wrote his story, A Little Hero. On the 22nd of December, 1849, the accused were all condemned to death and conveyed in large vans to a large scaffold in the Simonovsky place. As the soldiers were preparing to carry out the sentence, the prisoners were informed that their penalty was commuted to exile in Siberia. The novelist's sentence was 4 years in Siberia and enforced military service in the ranks for life. On Christmas Eve, 1849, he commenced the long journey to Omsk and remained in Siberia, quote, like a man buried alive, nailed down in his coffin, end quote, for 4 terrible years. His Siberian experiences are graphically narrated in a volume to which he gave the name of Recollections of a Dead House. It was known in an English translation as Buried Alive in Siberia. His release only subjected him to fresh indignities as a common soldier at Semipalatinsk, but in 1858, through the intercession of an old school fellow, General Toddleman, he was made an under-officer, and in 1859, upon the ascension of Alexander II, he was finally recalled from exile. In 1858, he had married a widow, Madame Isayev, but she died at St. Petersburg in 1867 after a somewhat stormy married life. After herding for years with the worst criminals, Dostoevsky obtained an exceptional insight into the dark and seamy side of Russian life. He formed new conceptions of human life, of the balance of good and evil in man, and of the Russian character. Psychological studies have seldom, if ever, found a more intense form of expression than that embodied by Dostoevsky in his novel Crime and Punishment. The hero, Raskolnikov, is a poor student who is led on to commit a murder, partly by self-conceit, partly by the contemplation of the abject misery around him. Unsurpassed in poignancy in the whole of modern literature is the sensation of compassion evoked by the scene between the self-tormented Raskolnikov and the humble streetwalker, Sonia, whom he loves, and from whom, having confessed his crime, he derives the idea of expiation. Raskolnikov finally gives himself up to the police and is exiled to Siberia, to where Sonia follows him. The book gave currency to a number of ideas, not in any sense new, but specially characteristic of Dostoevsky. The theory, for instance, that in every life, however fallen and degraded, there are ecstatic moments of self-devotion. The doctrine of purification by suffering, and by suffering alone. And the ideal of a Russian people forming a social state at some future period, bound together by no obligation save mutual love and the magic of kindness. In this visionary prospect, as well as in his objection to the use of physical force, Dostoevsky anticipated in a remarkable manner some of the conspicuous tenets of his great successor, Tolstoy. The book electrified the reading public in Russia upon its appearance in 1866, and its fame was confirmed when it appeared in Paris in 1867. To his remarkable faculty of awakening reverberations of melancholy and compassion, as shown in his earlier work, Dostoevsky had added a rare mastery over the emotions of terror and pity. But such mastery was not long to remain unimpaired. Crime and Punishment was written when he was at the zenith of his power, but they are unequal and deficient in measure and in balance. Partly the reason for this is many of his novels were written in extremely frantic circumstances. For about 9 months, for Crime and Punishment and The Gambler, written concurrently according to an agreement with the publisher that if he did not finish the works in time, he would sign over the rights to all of his literary works, past and present. His hiring of a stenographer, Anna Snitkin, greatly facilitated this accomplishment. After finishing both novels, he married her. The chief of his later works are The Injured and the Insulted, The Demons, The Idiot, The Adult, and The Brothers Karamazov. From 1865, when he settled in St. Petersburg, Dostoevsky was absorbed in a succession of journalistic enterprises. In the Slavophil interest, he suffered severe pecuniary losses. He had to leave Russia in order to escape his creditors and to seek refuge in Germany and Italy. He was further harassed by his troubles with his wife, and his work was interrupted by epileptic fits and other ailments. It was under such conditions as these that his most enduring works were created. He managed, finally, to return to Russia early in the 1870s, and was for some time director of the Russian World. From 1876, he published a kind of review entitled Carnet d'un écrivain, to the pages of which He committed many strange autobiographical facts and reflections. The last 8 years of his life were spent in comparative prosperity in St. Petersburg, where he died on the 9th of February, 1881. His life had been irredeemably seared by his Siberian experiences. He looked prematurely old. His face bore an expression of accumulated sorrow. In disposition, he had become distrustful, taciturn, contemptuous. His favorite theme, the superiority of the Russian peasant over every other class. As an artist, though uncultured, he had ever been subtle and sympathetic, but latterly he was tortured by tragic visions and morbidly preoccupied by exceptional and perverted types. M. de Vogue, in his admirable Écrivains Russes, has worked out with some success a parallel between the later years of Dostoevsky and those of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Siberia effectually convinced the novelist of the impotence of nihilism in such a country as Russia. But though he was assailed by ardent liberals for the reactionary trend of his later writings, Dostoevsky became, towards the end of his life, an extremely popular figure, and his funeral on the 12th of February, 1881, was the occasion of one of the most remarkable demonstrations of public feeling ever witnessed in the Russian capital. The death of the Russian novelist was not mentioned in the London press. It is only since 1885, when Crime and Punishment first appeared in English, that his name has become at all familiar in England, mainly through French translations. There is a lot of disinfo, deliberate ignorance, and intellectual dishonesty what the mRNA vaccine is and the mechanism behind it. I've joked about it being a gene-altering mystery fluid that doesn't do anything against Chinese lung herpes, but it's so much worse than that. mRNA technology has been around for a while. What kept it from being used in widespread vaccination was lacking a way to protect the mRNA long enough to get inside of cells and ribosomes, where it can be read to construct protein. Instead of admitting this, they, Moderna, Pfizer, etc., went ahead with an extremely lipid-soluble coating that would guarantee the mRNA injected easily and quickly passed through membranes and gets to the site of action, ribosomes. But it also meant that, unlike other vaccines, which have their particles taken up in normal lymph flow and end up in lymph nodes local to the site of injection, where foreign antigenic molecules are processed by dendritic cells and stay in the extracellular space otherwise, outside and in between cells, the interstitium. The mRNA injected in these vaccines ends up everywhere, easily passing from the interstitium to the bloodstream and across the blood-brain barrier. Compared with getting a virus, the virus is only able to bond with and enter some cells, injecting its genetic material and taking over production to make more virus. It is limited to cells displaying molecules each virus is capable of binding to. In the case of Chinese lung herpes, this is a molecule called ACE2. In normal vaccination, only dendritic and a few other immune cells, which are designed to ingest and deal with antigenic molecules, end up with viral proteins in them. These specific cells are part of the immune reaction that ends up with long-term and robust immunity. With mRNA vaccination, the injection is in the deltoid most of the time, but the particles of mRNA move easily in and out of cells and across biological membranes. Any cell, and subsequently its ribosomes, which come into contact with exogenous mRNA, will start to produce the altered Chinese lung herpes spike proteins that the mRNA instructs for. Man. In the normal course of cellular function, the master copy of your build and operating instructions, DNA, has a page or chapter photocopied as needed, mRNA, and sent out to factories, ribosomes, which read the instructions and build proteins according to them. During this process, whatever protein is being made gets reported back to the immune system. This happens by each of your cells taking one of the things its factories are making and displaying them on the outside of their cell membrane. You can think of this as a sign at city limits, which has an example of what each factory is making in a city. Security, T cells of the immune system, come by, but can't get inside. They just look at the sign to see if something is off. If something is, they can nuke the whole city, induce lysis, or tag the sign for other bulldozer immune cells to come by and level it. This function fights both cancer and viral infection. If either of those things cause a cell to start making abnormal or foreign proteins, then the cell is instructed to kill itself, lysis, or tagged to be destroyed by other immune cells. Up until now, in human history, you could only end up with antigenic, things which set off an immune response, molecules displayed to the immune system on a subset of cells. Either a virus infected your cells, and that virus could only attach and enter a tiny number of overall cells in your body, like Chinese lung herpes and cells which display ACE2. Or you can get cancer, which is essentially one cell over and over and over. Outside of that, antigenic molecules would be immediately destroyed by natural killer cells, or would be collected through lymph and processed, then displayed by dendritic cells in lymph tissue, nodes mostly. These dendritic cells look like massive tree root systems, and all they do is process foreign material and display it on major histocompatibility complex. That's the molecule complex that acts as the signs at city limits, announcing what's going on inside a cell to the outside world. It is the sign security, the immune system, monitors to know if there is an issue inside, as security is a cell itself and can't enter another cell. The immune system is blind to the intracellular environment besides these signs, the MHC. One type of T cell, T helper cells, move up and down the root system of the dendritic cell, just looking at all the signs. In this way, your lymph nodes and spleen, where this process mostly happens, act as security checkpoints, eventually coming across fragments of anything that ends up in your body. If they find something wrong, they induce an immune response to that thing, which will eventually reach wherever the molecules they saw came from. Back to what we are doing by injecting these lipid-soluble mRNA particles into people's bodies, littering them throughout all tissue, dependent on each individual's weight, lipid percentage, hydration, cardiovascular state, anatomy, etc. Wherever concentrations of these end up, you have random cells which start to produce altered spike proteins and display them on their signs. The immune system notices and starts attacking those areas. As each mRNA vaccinated cell is destroyed, they spill their contents of altered spike protein, cytotoxic itself, into the local area. The vaccine makers know the path to immune activation is through MHC signs, and they don't really address or care about all the excess spike protein being made. They don't want the sign to say altered spike protein, but in the background factories, ribosomes, are churning out actual spike protein into the inside of the cell. This is how a virus reproduces. As well, once infected, more viral particles are constructed inside a cell, but they don't get released to go infect other cells until the first infected cell is destroyed and they can escape. Once these signs are made, they are permanent, sort of. And this is where the analogy breaks down. All the atoms in your body are replaced about once a decade. Even your bones are constantly restructured by osteoclasts and osteoblasts. So every 10 years, you have entirely different atoms making up those bones. Even cells that generally don't replace or die until you do, like neurons and muscle. Well, muscle cells themselves get bigger when you work out. Mostly. You don't get new muscle cells, although nothing is ever 100%. Constantly replace their constituent parts. The MHC displaying the product the factories are making will stay embedded in the cell wall until that section of the membrane is replaced due to other natural processes, such as endocytosis. This means that people who end up with persistent neurological or cardiac side effects may have them for years, until most of the signs stating the cell is making spike proteins are torn down. For neurons in the brain, that could be years, not to mention the fact that in the meantime, the immune system is actively trying to kill off any of those cells, often successfully. This is why I've been joking and calling it gene-altering mystery fluid. I know it's not quite perfectly accurate, but hey, up yours. And at this point, I want to be proven wrong, and not just about this. Humanity did this blindly. There is so much we don't understand about this. A gigantic portion of your genome is dedicated to MHC. We don't have any idea about the mechanisms we are playing with. Not only are large swaths of MHC black boxes, but the whole question of clonal selection, how your body knows what is you and what isn't you, and therefore what to attack, is an open question. There are no longitudinal studies on any of this. The safety data is non-existent beyond it probably doesn't kill many of you in the first 90 days. Governments and corporations saw the opportunity to make hundreds of billions of dollars and quickly grabbed whatever was on the shelf, dusted it off, and rushed it to market. It's one of the reasons that massive and rapid distribution is the key. Not knowing what would happen, it was and is imperative to get as many doses injected as possible. While careful, isolated, controlled, longitudinal studies would easily recognize collective negative effects, even though the specifics differed, uncontrolled mass distribution during phase 4 study will make it easy to mask. Investigating any specifics, like myocarditis, will only ever bring up a low-level signal that is easily dismissed. Chinese lung herpes causes myocarditis too. The collective information provided by all the signals would tell a different story. The VAERS database provides the strongest signal, but is easily ignored due to its unverified nature. It will take years to collect the data and produce irrefutable results, which is why the normal process is around 6 years from a working product. Without control groups, even the data will be easy to skew in interpretation, though. Mild endogenous antibody therapy would be a better description, which is why they had to change the definition of the word vaccine. Also, cause some people cry and shit their pants at the mere notion of them or their loved ones gladly taking the gene-altering mystery fluid. I'm not going to bother vaguely asserting some education, position of authority, or access to unavailable information. On the contrary, anyone who listens to this will know what I'm talking about and will be able to see it and hear it plain as day. I tried my best to use both proper technical terminology so all this can be easily verified and even researched further. But to bridge the technical gap so anyone could understand the mechanism behind the gene-altering mystery fluid. By their nature, these mRNA supposed vaccines will only ever produce widespread, diffuse, and low-level specific signals. Every time anyone brings up a specific side effect, they won't get anywhere. And legacy media, the chattering class, journalists, that whole State Department to the Chapo Trap House, to the bread tuber, to the commentariat class pipeline, will always have the fallback of basically the same as without the vaccine, but having COVID. What about the risk before? How come people were and still are banished from social media and fired from their jobs for bringing this up? Just imagine people whose lives were upended for statements like myocarditis is nearly unheard of in children, or man, flies are dropping like athletes. I hope this helps someone explain to a loved one and win them over. As more and more shots are mandated to keep antibody levels high, and since when are you supposed to walk around with high antibody levels? That's a sign of infection, not immunity. Antibody levels should fade quickly and be replaced with primed memory cells. People's careers end, and anyone speaking about this is silenced. But people will have questions, and most will only be answered with people's lives. What happens if someone who took the gene-altering mystery fluid brings a kid into the world with someone who didn't? What if you need a kidney, or a liver, or a heart, and I'm no longer here, so you take it? But I didn't get the gene-altering mystery fluid, and you did. Now what?
Anatomy of the heads. It's like the news, if the news were memories of warriors dismembering a golem made of spray-on tan and talking points. Then an Amazon shows up and dances over remains of the golem's harem of mud women.
If things are worse than a bad day, I do this thing where I stab a 10-pound block of cheese when I'm upset. I've been doing it a lot more lately. I keep it in the freezer because I don't want to waste that much cheese. And yes, I will be eating it shortly. And if you get any ideas from this, you're gonna want a knife with a hilt for stabbing. That's the little crossbar between the handle and the blade. A chef's knife wasn't made for stabbing, and if your hand slips, you're gonna wind up with a nasty cut. Remember, safety counts. A lot of people with careers in academia pretend they're educated after being instructed by the pedagogical equivalent of a Mobius strip. All pharaohs have traditionally played down their predecessors in order to elevate their own prominence. But there is an especially resentful tone to how much vandalism Akhenten's legacy endured. It is a sin against God and a crime against humanity that Andy Kaufman never got to experience YouTube. Angela Merkel looks like Anthony Hopkins in drag with a crippling whippets addiction. Anti-racism is the purest form of white supremacy and white culture imperialism because all minorities are racist. The Chinese hate blacks. Arabs hate Jews. Blacks hate whites, etc., etc. The white stance of relativizing all racism undermines the objectivity of everyone's hatred. There are a couple of points I want to clarify about Asian Americans. 1. The entire collective identity of Asian American was manufactured from the top down by a small group of college graduates in the 1960s and 1970s, creating a bunch of ethnic pressure groups, professional associations, activist organizations, and so on. Many suspect this was done with Chinese money. It was an "if you build it, they will come" approach. Nobody prior to the existence of organizations like the NAAAP or the Asian American Legal Defense Fund actually conceived of themselves as Asian. 2. East Asians
in spite of all the wailing about Orientalism, actually love the idea that they are this super inscrutable group of people who everyone else fails to understand because they're so deep and mysterious. It gives them a sense of identity and exclusivity, and feeds into their collective sense of self-importance and otherness from everyone else. Which ties into another idea. Deep down, most Asian Americans don't like the idea of giving up their racial identities as much as they like to whine about how Americans treat them as perpetual outsiders, as if they've done nothing to warrant this in the first place anyway. 3. Asians aren't actually a stoical people. This is a common misconception. They attempt a veneer of inscrutability, but inscrutableness is distinct from a stoic mindset. Americans often get this confused about them. If you ever get to know more than a few Asian Americans, particularly the men, they're deeply passive-aggressive, angry, and neurotic. There's nothing detached or stoical about them. Asian desserts are shit tier anyway. These people think just eating a bunch of mushed up red beans with sugar sprinkled on top is a dessert. Life dealt me a bad hand, but I worked at it. I got all the cards together until I became the fucking dealer. But now we're playing chess. Bangladesh is less than half the size of Germany, but has a population of around 170 million, more than twice as large. Remember the Ben-Hur remake? It made me very happy that everyone understands that this movie crossed a line that should not have been crossed. Hey kids, remember Bernie Sanders? Of course you don't. But here's one thing he got wrong. It wasn't canceling student debt, but wanting everyone to go to college for free. Subsidizing college education is how we got here and made degrees worthless in the first place. At least 1/3 of colleges should go bankrupt. All the loss on student loan debt was already figured into the whole system by colleges to begin with. They don't hold your debt. They sell it to third-party companies for pennies on the dollar. Are there people out there who seriously don't want to fuck those slime balls over? How do you even end up in a gig like that? Anyways, socialists are crazy, as if I'm gonna give all my hard-earned money to the government so they can redistribute it to non-productive parasites. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to give all my hard-earned money to my global financial institution so they can redistribute it to bankers. Cast iron pans. You gotta get yourself one. They last forever, and they don't poison you. Wipe it with cooking oil after cleaning to avoid rust. If it rusts, you'll get microparticles of that in your food, which is obviously bad for you. Cities have become cultural dead zones, filled with lonely, bitter, singles stuck in their urban boxes next to shuttered cocktail bars and faux ethnic eateries, only venturing out to walk their useless, tiny dog that squeaks, shivers, and dies. Sometimes they walk that thing in a mask. They usually cross the street at the sight of a native, local, townie, and especially if they're a woman, anyone bigger or darker than them. On a larger scale, it's a half-assed Soviet Union without cool aesthetics or Ubermensch Olympic doping programs. Just endless witch hunts, struggle sessions, and purges on behalf of wanton degenerates, history's losers and tribes cynically using universalism to advance their own interests. You know, the communist struggle sessions and purges at least had some horrendous clarity to them. I wonder how many people thought their tiny Bugman apartments would be one of millions riven by dark, rainy, neon-lit warrens. Cities teeming with mercs from Zaibatsu Rheinmetall and Miltech pushing hyper-reality drugs. Instead, they wait for Google Docs to sync. They listlessly wait for the next Zoom call to take without pants. And wonder, during quiet moments of thought and private moments of reflection, if there's anything new on Disney+. Comedy is the start of cultural change. A good comedian is not afraid of society's self-imposed rules on politeness and correctness. All of the funniest comedians in history are hilarious because they push the envelope. Challenging people's beliefs is always a good way to get a funny, shocking laugh out of a crowd. Aristotle said it all on comedy. Read what the man gives you for free. The root of humor is reconciling incongruities. It is a reaction to the annihilation of perceived structure and a form of ego death. Scientologists buy thousands of copies of Dianetics to keep it on the bestsellers lists. Or at least they did, until the New York Times book review just started taking $25,000 bribes for placement. What is to be done about the discarded American proletariat? I have a lot of sympathy for drug addicts, and I have sympathy for fat people too. I've seen extremely fat people lose weight. They became happier. They had fewer health problems. It's not like all the disdain for obesity is rooted in intolerance. But I'm not going to cheer on a bunch of coke addicts because they're proud of their inevitable premature heart failure either. Once upon a time, back when the East Coast had 4 seasons, in Ecuador, 1 large jade cup and 12 smaller jade cups were found. Each of the smaller cups were a little bit different in size, but if you were to fill each one and pour them into the larger one, the contents would exactly fill the larger cup. The large cup has a perfect inlaid star constellation, showing Orion and other stars. Klaus Dona stated, quote, "Inside the big cup it is very, very magnetic, and outside the cup, nearly nothing. Professional geologists are saying this is impossible, because if a stone has metal particles inside, it must be magnetic from both sides." End quote. If scientists say that it is impossible to have a very magnetic inside of a jade cup with a non-magnetic outside of the same cup, then who created these vessels and where did they come from? Congratulations! You've earned 2 virtue points to be added to your social credit score. Pat yourself on the back for being an effective citizen. This is an automated message. They're totally not afraid, guys. So not afraid they're making endless propaganda. The day a ship is sinking and we all get to leave at the same time instead of women and children first. That's equality, and it doesn't exist in nature. When a thing defies physical law, there's usually politics involved. Drought, floods, crop failures, and insect pests played a part in disasters like every famine of the 20th century. But they were never caused by nature. The Holodomor, China's Great Famine, the Cambodian famine between 1975 and 1979, nothing to do with weather or acts of God. During the potato blight that starved millions of the Irish, England's corn laws made other sources of food in Ireland so expensive that they were still exporting grain during the worst of the famine years, 1846 to 1851. The British-imposed system of absentee landlords let the gentry keep a comfortably distant perspective on the suffering of their tenants. In The Geography of Famine by David Arnold, we see that all the famines in Russia from 971 to 1970 can be attributed to human factors. Since 1500, food records from Britain and France indicate 0 famines coincided with empty national granaries. Implementing falsehoods as the basis for their understanding of the world has adversely affected the personal and professional lives of people who bought into. The Flintstone Kids were clearly a ripoff of Jackie Gleason's Honeymooners Babies. Pick something. Anything. Now, think of me assuming it's wrong. So my entire argument rests on a presupposition. And then you could point at me and hopefully look at your homies and be like, I bet Galileo was wrong because everyone around him and the church disagreed with him. Half-Life 1 had a bare-bones story, which works great because the game almost never stops to tell you the plot. So you feel like you don't know shit, because how the fuck would Gordon know shit? Half-Life 2, well, the game constantly stops to tell you the plot, and it's fucking awful. Completely ruins whatever plot the original had, and the episodes only further fuck it up by putting dumb cliffhangers that you know will never pay off. I guess Half-Life 3 was purgatory all along, and Gordon died in the reactor. Who knows? Maybe Gordon's guilt has led him to live a perpetual bad end that will never resolve itself.
What's up, ladies and jerks? You like things that don't suck. So for more of the finest garbage this side of Meat Space, come on down to the Trash Radio Patreon. I can't promise that my buttery, trashy voice will stop rearranging things in your living room when you're not home.